view that all Muslims carry, and unfortunately a lot of Muslims have swung one way or the other when it comes to this balance that the Quran maintains. And it's an indication of how far we've gotten from the Quran's way of thinking. The Quran promotes a certain kind of thinking, and when we get away from the Quran, then we actually get away from the way we're supposed to be thinking clearly about stuff. Okay, so you have, for example, as a reaction to extreme materialism, you have a taqwa-based reaction that everything that is new and luxurious and nice about the world, or any new technology, or all of it's haram, all of it is fitnah, all of it is kufr. Stay away from it, because it reminds us of the fitna of Masih al-Dajjal, or for some other reasons, right? So the Muslims, you'll notice the more conservative they are, they tend to actually think of everything that's related to technology or luxury as something evil, as something bad, as something you should not have anything to do with, right? That's one extreme. Of course, when you have that extreme, I want to talk specifically about Muslim society, this final part of my introduction. We've talked about Christians enough. We've talked about the mushrikun, we've talked about other stuff. We haven't talked about the Muslims. Because this surah is protection for who? For Muslims. So now we have to talk about, in this final intro, about Muslims. So I'm going to give you an assessment that is basically entirely my own assessment. It's really entirely my own assessment. But I see the role of this surah directly for Muslims given the assessment that I personally have. I'm not going to force that on you. I'm simply going to share it with you. The more I've traveled, I've come to a particular kind of observation about what's happening in the Ummah today. And I used to think that our problems in the United States are our problems. They're unique to us. But the more I've traveled, the more I've realized actually our problems are pretty universal, with some differences and unique aspects to our problems here and there. What the Ummah is going through is actually overwhelmingly similar. It's overwhelmingly similar. It's also interesting to note that we're going to get guidance in the surah from youth, right? إِنَّهُمْ فِتْيَةٌ آمَنُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ. There were young people, and the majority of the Ummah today, over 65%, is under the age of 35. Right? So we're actually an Ummah of youth. That's what we are, globally speaking. Right? So now, my assessment of that problem is basically as follows. The Muslims were colonized for quite some time. Right? And under colonial rule, Muslims had different kinds of reactions to the powers that colonized them, whether it was the French or the Germans or the Italians or the Spaniards, or mostly the British, because the British, they spread everywhere. They just took over. It's kind of surprising to see they have such a little tiny island in Europe now. Because what they were to what they are now, it's kind of like, wow, you guys really shrunk. Like, I make all kinds of jokes when I go to England. I was explaining Surah Al-Shu'ara one time, and in Surah Al-Shu'ara, it's the day on which people gather. That's Musa is going to challenge the magicians, alayhi salam, on the day when people gather, Yawmuz Zina, And I said, it's kind of like Independence Day, kind of like July the 4th, whatever. People get out, parade. Oh wait, no, you guys don't know what that is. People get Independence Day from you people. You wouldn't know what that is, okay? But anyway, so what happens in the Muslim world, okay, so we start, our first reactions were, we want nothing to do with these colonizers. We should fight them. We should fight back. So what happens in India, what happens in much of the Arab world, in the Africas? We tried to fight the European colonizers. They had made their influence through trade, right? They got established and built infrastructure and networks and connections, and they got really deeply entrenched and they couldn't be moved. Or we tried to fight them, and did that work out for us anywhere? No, we got slaughtered. Our ulama got slaughtered, imams got slaughtered, people got just massacred, all over the Muslim world. It's the same story. You go from one continent to the other, the tragedy is identical. Then we realize we can't do this. We have to be part of the political process. We have to get ahead too, because the other nations that are living under them, because for example in India there was the Hindu population, the Sikh population, they're getting ahead because they're learning English and they're getting jobs. We're not getting any jobs because we're saying that's the language of the kuffar. So what do the huge population of Muslims do? We have to learn English too. We better learn to eat with a fork and spoon also. So they did. And they tried to assimilate as best they could to get ahead in the world. And it worked to some extent. But the ulama class, the scholars, they said, no, this is wrong. This is all wrong. We're not only accepting, a suit and tie, but we're also accepting, their value system. We're accepting that their education system is superior. We're losing our values as Muslims. So we need to cut ourselves off from all of this. So they established institutions that were basically you can say walled off, okay? To save the teachings of Islam. We can't fight the enemy, so at least preserve Islam. So within these quarantined kind of seminaries in the Muslim world, we would wear clothes that we've been wearing for hundreds of years. We would speak the language of the Muslims. Arabic would be celebrated, right? We would follow the Hijri calendar. We would eat on the floor with our hands. We would maintain tradition. But as soon as you come out of those seminary walls, what do you see in the Muslim world? Everybody else is westernized. You understand? So they like to stay inside. They were preserving Islam. And by the way, if they had opened the doors, Islamic traditional education may not have survived. You know, one of the most traditional institutions in India, or the region entirely, is the institution of Deoband, right? Which is the standard is an 8-year traditional program. Did you know when it was established, it was considered a modern innovation? Because 8 years of a program with curriculum and courses you have to take and graduate, this is all Western. The traditional way of learning is you sit with a sheikh until you get ijazah, then you sit with another sheikh and get another ijazah. And it's an individualized system. Why are you turning it into an institution? They are considered hyper-conservative and traditional now, but when they were actually instituted, they were considered a bid'ah entirely. But they actually helped, and institutions like theirs help preserve Islam in a region. You know, and this happened all over. Now, in the meantime, the masses of Muslims are not getting an Islamic education anymore because the scholars that would provide that education have now, for the most part, concerned themselves with inner circles, right? In Jumu'ah you might hear something, or that's it. So now what kind of education are the rest of the Muslims getting? They're getting a Western education. And the West has just experienced a renaissance. So what kind of education are they getting? An education where 3 things are more important, or 4 things are more important than 4 other things. What 4 things are more important? As opposed to God? Physical universe. As opposed to the soul? The body. As opposed to the next life? This life. As opposed to standard morality? Relative morality. That's the education they're getting now. They're receiving this education and they're taking it all in. You know, to give you an interesting example of that, even after liberation for a lot of these countries, like where I come from, Pakistan, in Pakistan, they didn't update textbooks for a long time. So the standard 8th grade, because I went to 8th grade in Pakistan, so I know this firsthand. Standard 8th grade curriculum, they teach you Newtonian physics. You learn Newton in 8th grade in Pakistan. And Newton says that matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Yes? And our physics class was right before our Islamic studies class. An Islamic studies class, you're learning قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. The one who has no beginning and no end, who is he? Allah. And right one period before that in physics class, what are you learning? Even though Einsteinian physics has come and now we know matter can be created and destroyed and the relationship between matter and energy and all of that, but they're not updated textbooks. So they're still teaching matter can neither be created nor destroyed. But even if you're not updated scientifically, should you have a problem with that statement given the fact that you're believers in God? Matter can neither be created nor destroyed. This is a problematic statement, isn't it? But people didn't see that as a problem. They're teaching it in Islamic school, and they're hearing the adhan, and they're memorizing. And they don't, the way you study in Pakistan for an exam is you do hifz of the book. So adhan is going on, it's because matter can neither be created nor destroyed, matter can neither be created nor destroyed, matter can neither be created. I know this because I did that. I did wird of matter can neither be created nor destroyed. You see what I'm saying? So, this strange dichotomy was created. Strange dichotomy was created. As a result, if you fast forward, here's what happens. We got politically liberated from Western colonization. But economically, and more importantly, educationally, we were not liberated. Educationally, we remained mentally colonized. So for example, if you travel to Algeria today, one of the greatest aspirations for an Algerian youth, you know what it is? To move to France. Like his dream is to get a job in France. Now the problem with that is his grandfather died fighting the French. You understand? Like this is not too long ago. The blood hasn't even dried yet. And now there's this obsession with all things French. And even more English actually. Even more English. So you have this, what they left behind, this imprint that they left behind, that's spread across society. Universities and other institutions. Meanwhile, when the colonizers left, the scholars came out of the cave. Okay? They said, hey, the trouble's over. We can come out now, and we can be back be part of the essence of society. And before colonization, what role did scholars have in society? They had a central role in society. They were the most respected and revered in society. They were the intellectuals of society. They were the moral, standard of that society. They were the intellectual standard of that society. They were, in some sense, even social elite in our societies, in Muslim societies. After colonization, thank you Brits, you've gone now. The ulama come out of these institutions. They come back into society expecting that the Muslims are going to greet them with huge celebrations and put them back on the pedestal they used to be. And when they give a khitab, all the people are going to gather around them, but they'll notice something very different. The world changed around them. By the time they got out the cave, it wasn't what they expected. They're not hostile towards them, but they're not what they were expecting either. So you have people that say, well, I don't really see you as too much of a credible source of knowledge because you don't even have a basic bachelor's degree. What have you studied? Sharia? What have you studied, like Quran and Hadith? Well, what else do you know? You don't know anything. You can't even speak English. Well, what do you know about Freud? What do you know about Darwin? What do you know about anything? So for the vast majority of Muslims, the middle class Muslims that received an education, part of that education was imams are their own little circle that don't know anything about the real world. Scholars are their own little circle. They don't really know how the world really works. You understand? So what is their place? Where do imams, we can't hate them. Where do they belong though? They belong in the masjid. They don't belong in the Senate. They don't belong in the education committee. They don't belong in administration. They don't belong in the political discussions. They belong in the masjid, which is interesting because when the people of the cave came out, people said, لَنَتَّخِذَنَّ عَلَيْهِمْ مَسْجِدًا. Well, let's just put a masjid over them, right? But that's a later discussion, okay? So they come out and they're completely disconnected from society and they try to preach to society, but it's just not going the way it used to. People aren't interested anymore. As a matter of fact, in many places in the world, the average middle-class Muslim that's received a fair education, let's say they're an accountant or they're a medical school, or they're a medical doctor or they're an engineer, if you ask them their opinion of traditional scholars, you'll hear some really horrible things. You'll hear some pretty bad things. They don't think highly of Islamic scholarship. So unfortunately, what